I am the director for the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support at Illinois State University, and we have put together our LEAD series for OET, and this is Leadership Excellence, Action, and Development. And these are really put together looking at all the research around these particular topics, bringing that research to you in a nice condensed format and allowing you to have those conversations with us. And we do have a lot of chats and things as we move through the conversation today, because there's a lot of great information around program management. So with that, I'd like to just kind of move to the next slide there. And today we're going to talk about project management, taking initiative and being accountable, and what that looks like. And we have some tips, we have some strategies, and then we also have just some good advice around making sure that we don't go crazy on project management. So a couple things for all of you as you're getting comfortable there. In the bottom, if you toggle along the bottom there, you should be able to see your chat, unless you're one of those people who have that permanently lighted up, which you can. And we are going to ask you to engage in the chat. And then in addition to that, all of you are able to unmute yourselves. So we do want this to be a conversation. We want it to be engaging and have unmute, let us know, or there's a lot of reaction. So if you go into your reaction, you can do like what I've posted up there, some kind of announcement or raising your hand or clapping, things like that. So I know it's Friday, I know it's March Madness, but it's 9 a.m. and that doesn't start till 11. So let's get into the project management. Can we go to the next slide, please? This is me, Amy Julian. Next, most of you know who I am, and if not, I've been in the system for, oh, good Lord, almost 20 years, and have been working with professional development around career and technical education, adult education, and workforce education for the past 5 years. Co-presenting with me today is Molly Cook. Molly is our workforce research coordinator. She staffs the CIC, the Equity Task Force, the Career Pathways Targeted Population Committee, and then the Evaluation Work Group with ICSPS. She has a BS, Bachelor's of Science in Sociology and Theology, and she has her MS in Sociology from Illinois State University. She is new to our team, so we're giving you a little bit more information on her. She started with us in October and has done an outstanding job. And she really has a great background in economic development. Her specialization is understanding homelessness and the impacts of homelessness. And Molly, anything else you want to add to what I've done to introduce you there?
No, that's a great job, and I'm looking forward to talking with everyone today.
Fantastic. Moving along, upcoming. So just a reminder, we're going to be back together on April 16th. And this is where we're going to talk about managing your schedule like a boss, the art of delegation and saying no. And some of you are saying, wait a second, Amy, I just heard you saying that you were working last night and did not get to watch basketball. And that is only because I'm taking off next week to spend time with my family. So I needed to get all caught up. So I do try to be a little bit better about my delegation and managing my schedule. So hope you'll join us on April 16th for that very fun and engaging presentation. Next up.
Amy, have you sent that notice out? I generally add these to my calendar right away, and I don't have that one.
I will send that out right after we're done here to make sure it's on everybody's calendar. Yeah, I sent the reminder this morning on that as well.
Thank you.
So as we get started here, as I said, we're going to have you engaged this morning. How many of you, this is going to be a poll question, how many of you are on teams that more often than not reach their goals, deadlines, and goals? I said that backwards. Leave that up for about 30 seconds and let everyone answer. And Molly and I are going to co-present today more as a conversation, and we do want you to engage with us in that conversation because all of us have some level of experience in project management and do run into some of those crazy issues that happen.
Well, Amy, it looks like it's about 60% of people are on teams that do more often than not reach their goals, and then only 10% said no, and about 30% it depends.
Excellent.
So that's great. So more than not are reaching those goals.
That is fantastic. That means you have some great teams. In the chat now, we'd like you to think about or think back on past teams you've been on. What is one thing a project manager, coach, or leader has done well to motivate your team and keep you on track? Let's go ahead and post that in the chat. Positive feedback. Thank you. Very good.
I agree with that, Brian. I find that it's much more motivating to do work when it feels appreciated. Mark says constant communication. Yes, we're going to talk about that today, making sure that communication is clear. I heard a great quote the other day, and someone said that clear is kind in terms of communication. So definitely.
Well, we've talked a lot in this series about how, because of the pandemic, it is so important to over communicate. One of the things that, as our own team, because we're all still remote, and I'm guessing many of you are as well still remote, we've done is that if you're going to be out, so for example, when I'm out next week, I not only send an email to my team saying, hey, I'm going to be out, I also have it on my calendar because we have that shared, everybody can see everybody's calendar. But then I also put my out of office on and say, I'm out of the office. And that does, that it's kind of a three-pronged approach, but it's the same thing that you would do if you were in space together and seeing each other every day. Time management. Thank you, Laura. Fantastic. Time management is really important, and allowing time for whatever that goal is to be achieved and discussions to take place is really important.
Chelsea said creating a large chart in the main office and checking off boxes once certain tasks have been completed. That is awesome. That is so great. It's a nice visual to see how far we've come and how close the finish line is. I think that visual representation sounds really helpful.
And Chelsea, there's a, I would say, Chelsea, there's a lot of really fun online, because again, maybe we don't have those big whiteboards in our offices. Can you show me, show of hands, how many of you are in an office right now, back in an office, and how many of you are still at home? Or somebody let me know. I thought most of you are still working from home. Is that correct?
That is correct. Most of us are at home still.
Okay, so that idea of a big, thank you, Laura, that idea of a big visual is great when we're all in the office, but there are some online tools, and we'll talk about those even on Teams and some of the things that you have access to, that you can create that same idea of checking off boxes and seeing that tasks are complete, to showing that visual of how far you're coming. But it's going to be on your computer on a Teams format. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Helping delegate each team member's responsibilities. Delegation is really important, and then we're going to talk about that today and then again on the 16th. So thank you all for your great comments. So our agenda today is, and I think we are kind of getting all in that mindset of project management. We're going to talk about project life cycle. We're going to talk about tips for each phase of the project through the life cycle, and then we're going to provide you with a ton of resources to help you move, navigate, and strategize about your project management system and how you want to look at that. So next slide. The project lifecycle does talk about initiation, planning, execution, and closure. And before we get into this, I want to kind of set the groundwork of understanding that within project management, there are a couple things we need to keep in mind. Before we get started, before we get into that initiation, that planning, and that execution, we need to understand what success means to the project. So how are we defining success? How are we as a team, as we're putting that team together, and when we're initiating and planning, that's a really good point to say, and Molly will talk about this, what success means. Because how do you know if you've achieved it? How do you know if you're successful if you don't define it and say, this is where we're going to be successful? We also need to give each other grace and understand that challenges and constraints could impact the success of the project. I think if we've learned nothing from COVID, is that the whole world can be turned upside down. And I'm going to bet that most of you, if not all of you, had a work plan that was either completely shot or flipped or changed or transformed by the pandemic last March. So just keep in mind that, understand that challenges and constraints do happen, and we plan, and document, and then we are as flexible as we can be. So When those things happen, I do want to also encourage you to turn back to the project management book of knowledge, which is what we're going to be providing you today, what that book of knowledge is, what that foundational tips and tricks are, what are those things that you can do, and then document your process and document your required documents and what are you going to need from people. Again, back to that idea of making sure we can delegate, but also that clear communication that's always essential. And then in all aspects of life, and just to be keeping us sane. I don't know if you all tuned in on Wednesday for the Mental Health Toolkit Wednesday webinar, but be flexible, give yourself grace, understand that when things happen that impact your project management, impact the way in which you're moving towards your goal, be flexible. Okay, what do we do now? How do we adapt? How do we move? Are we resilient? And keep that in mind that it's not going to always go exactly to plan. I will tell you in my experience, 90% of the time, it does not go exactly to plan. Something happens that we shift and adapt and move and are flexible. We still attain our goal, but I think we need to just keep in mind as we're moving through here. And Molly and I are going to share some great strategies with you on how to navigate that, but also just be flexible. So with that, Molly, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Okay, great. Kirsten, if you could go to the next slide, we are going to start going through each of these phases in the project life cycle. Now, before even getting into the project life cycle, I added a pre-phase one, which I think is equally important. And that pre-phase one is getting to know yourself and how you work within groups so that as a project manager or a team member, you can easily see if a team will be a good fit for you. So as a project manager, as a potential project manager, if someone has asked you to lead a project, the first thing you'll want to do is talk to others. You'll want to talk to people who lead similar groups to see their advice and their experience, see what materials are already in place so there's no reinventing of the wheel going on, and then really make sure that you're clear on the expectations of whoever established this project, of what they're looking for, so that that's always at the forefront. If you're asked to join a team, you'll want to do these same things and talk to others, talk about what is the time expectation on your end, what are the resource expectations, so that you make sure that you know that going in. You'll also want to research other programs and groups that have completed similar work. There's been many times where I felt like I've had this life-changing idea or this innovative idea, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is great. I know no one has ever done this before. And then I look online and someone has, and that's great because then it's someone who can share resources and insights with you. It's also really helpful if you're researching similar work, let's say in another state, in another county, another town, because you'll have benchmarks to compare your own work with as well. Next, you're going to want to consider your own work style. So if you're leading a group or a team, who do you work well with? How much time do you have to give? And how do you work? I know when I get a big project, for example, I'd much prefer to work on a little chunk of it each day rather than do it all in one chunk. Versus I was talking to one of our team members at ICSPS today, and she prefers to work on projects in 2 or 3 hour time blocks. So it's good to know how you work and how your team members work. And all of these will help you to assemble a great team. So you can go to the next slide, Kirsten. I love this quote. I don't know if any of you have read Brené Brown, are familiar with Brené Brown. I'm currently reading her book, Dare to Lead. And as I was preparing this presentation, came across this quote. Self-awareness and self-love matter. Who we are is how we lead. And I think that this is really just reiterates the importance of that pre-phase one, of getting to know yourself, how you are as both a team member or as a team leader. Because once you know how you work, you'll be able to find people with complementary strengths to help with the things that maybe are a little more challenging for you. We can go to the next slide. So in the chat, please type in what steps you usually take prior to joining a team or taking on the role of a project manager or staff member. Or you can answer, are there any that you wish that you did?
I'm going to guess that sometimes we just get delegated and thrown into a team. So if that is the case for you, I know I know that we've experienced that. It's like, hey, guess what? I have a great opportunity for you. What are those things that you wish that steps that you could take prior to joining a team? So either what do you do, or what are things that you'd like to see or would like to have the time to do? I'll give you a second to be typing. So one of the things that I like to do is really look at what is the scope or the charge, or what are we taking on? And that way I can do an evaluation of what I can bring to the table. So in my personal array of toolboxes, I have experience in equity, I have experience in curriculum development, I have experience in professional development. And so what kind of looking at that from a perspective of why am I being asked and what expertise do I need to bring to the table?
Yeah, that's a great one, Amy. One that I really like to think about is the timeline. So I like to hear what the timeline is for the final project, and then what those steps are in between to get to the timeline, just so I can plan ahead for knowing, okay, the deadline is in October. I know October is going to be a very busy month, and knowing that in advance. We will have lots of opportunities for further ideas and thinking about this throughout the presentation. Mark noted not only timeline to final, but what are the intermediary benchmarks to achieve along the way? Yeah, Mark, I think that's a really good point. It's a very good point. So Kirsten, you can go ahead and move on to the next slide. We're going to get into phase 1 now, which is that initiation phase. And in the initiation phase, this will involve creating something called a project charter. Now, this could be called many different things. You might hear project summary, project overview, but essentially this is a document which defines the vision and mission of what your work group, task force, or work team is working on, the structure. So maybe you're a team of 8 to 10 who is doing all the work. Maybe you're a task force of 50 people and you have smaller work groups of 8 to 10 who are completing a lot of the nitty-gritty type work. You're going to set the deadlines, and like Mark said, that's your timeline to the final project, but also those intermediary benchmarks. And then determine your budget, your staff, and your team members. And this is almost, I like to think of it like your elevator pitch. So on the next slide, I have an example of a pretty simple project charter that we're using in one of the work groups that I staff. And this just reviews our mission. So this reviews the mission of 3 of the work groups of our equity task force. So each mission is listed, and then it goes over our scope, which happens to be target populations for our task force. And then at the bottom, it displays our framework and approach. And I'll go into that a little bit further later, but it describes how we're going to process information, process data, and reach our final goal. So you could do this as simply as this. Your project charter could be longer. At the end of this session, I'll have resources for you with about 3 different examples of project charters. And on the next slide, I have a few items for you to consider as you're creating those timelines and team members and thinking about those items. So as you'll see in this quote, this is a quote from the BBC, and it discusses the planning fallacy. And the planning fallacy is the idea that we always tend to overestimate how long something will actually take us. And I can speak true to that. I think sometimes when I'm planning deadlines or how long I'll think something will take me, I assume that nothing could possibly go wrong and that everything will go exactly according to plan. And as Amy mentioned earlier, while sometimes that does happen to us, it's important that we be flexible and be realistic when we're thinking about time. I've been liking to give the example recently, and I used to do a lot of event planning. So I used to think, okay, if I want to hold this event in 6 months, I'll be totally ready, good to go. But I forget all the other work that I have going on and that team members have going on. So a 6-month deadline would often be bumped to 9. So there are some tips though for how to think about timelines and deadlines in a realistic way for both those intermediary benchmarks and long-term goals. My favorite.
Go ahead,
Amy.
I was gonna say that is also something that is often imposed on us and not that we get to control. So for example, many of you are aware of HB 2170, that we did not get to say how long it would take the system to do a feasibility study. they said we want one and we need it by this time. So sometimes those timelines are imposed on us and then we have to work within those time constraints. But please go ahead with your example because I know it's fantastic.
Yeah, and you're totally right, Amy. And often in work, we don't have a lot of flexibility with timelines. The part that's helpful that we can control, though, is if we know the final deadline, we can look at our calendars and our schedules and plan to make sure that we're getting the work done within that timeline. And thinking about like, okay, so I need to have this report done by Thursday for this. How long is it actually going to take me to do this report? So I make sure that I'm planning accordingly. So one great idea is that the BBC suggests that you estimate how long something is going to take you during the lowest point of your day. So rather than I'm a morning person, I'm not going to decide how long a report is going to take me at 8 a.m. when I get started, because I'm going to say 1 hour, when I'm really tired at 2, it might take me a little longer. There's the 3-point estimation you could use, which is your best case time, your middle case, and then your worst case. You could ask someone else to estimate for you. So talk to someone who doesn't know a lot about a project or a report you're working on and ask them how long they think it'd take them. And then also just to use historical data. So think about when you've done similar things in the past and how long it took you then. But yes, Amy, that is a really good point. We don't have a say in that a lot of the time. We just have a say in how we block out our own calendars and estimate our own time to get a project done. Kirsten, could you go to the next slide? Great. So we're all working on teams, and this is all about teams. So something that is really important in working on teams is to recognize the strength of your teammates and do our best to appreciate those and see how we can work best together to accomplish our goals. I really liked this quote that the strength of the team is each individual member. The strength of each member is the team. And I'm going to go through several examples of how we can recognize those strengths. I like to share this story. At my fiance's work, they do an exercise they have weekly meetings, and they'll go around and they'll state an example of how they saw one of their team members' strengths played out that week. So if you go to the next slide, Kirsten, they use a tool called Strengths Finder. Now, has anyone, you can just use the raising hand icon or put it in the chat. Has anyone done the Strengths Finders test before? Are you familiar with what I'm about to describe? If you have, I'll wait for a second to see if I get any reactions. So
doesn't look like anybody has. So
yeah, it looks like this may be new. That's great. Strengths Finder is a test that was put out by Gallup. It's a pretty short test, and it identifies your strengths. And you'll take the quiz, and it gives you 5 strengths. They fall into the categories that you see on your screen, and those are the things that you're really good at. And so they all apply to work in teams. So his team, for example, all took Strengths Finders, and they're aware of each person's strengths. So perhaps when a role on a project comes up that's particularly well for someone who is really focused, then they know who has the strength of focus. On the next slide, I have another tool that you could use if you're trying to find out not only just more about your own, how you personally work, but your team members work. There's a quiz called 16 Personalities online, and that's a free quiz. It's based off of the Myers-Briggs assessment, if any of you are familiar with that. So rather than giving you an acronym for what your personality is, they assign you a character, such as in a book. So characters like the protagonist or the protector. And they also give you quite a lengthy report that describes how you work in teams. I've been in a work setting before where I've worked on a team, and we've all taken this, and then we've discussed our results. And there's a section called workplace, how you function in the workplace. And we've shared that with one another. And it really helps me to understand my teammates and how they're working and how they like to conduct their work, and also how I communicate with them personally. There's one other aspect that is really great to consider, which this is a slide that may look familiar to you. We talked about small group roles last month with Kirsten's presentation on this professional development. And so just thinking about the roles that both you and team members take on in groups, those task roles, relationship roles, and disruptive roles. And of course, if you wanted to review any of these, they are on the ICSPS website. You could always go back and look at the presentation from last month. So next we have another chat that I'd love for any of you to jump in on. When you are on a team, how do you get to know the strengths of your teammates?
This is really important as we are in the virtual workplace at this time, because what has happened is we have a lot of new people, or we have people moving into different roles, and we might not understand exactly where their strengths lie. And so do they speak up and say, hey, I'm a great editor, or call out their strengths? Or how do you work in a team has a flexible style in identifying strengths? Thank you, Chelsea, for their past trials and errors of task. Excellent. But what if they're new? Do we ask them those questions? Or sorry, go ahead. I was gonna say a bit of both is fantastic. I'd like to have both in the chat, please.
Something that's really helped me when I've either been new on a team or someone new is brought onto a team I'm on is to ask people what type of work they really enjoy or what roles they like taking on in teams. Sometimes that's hard to identify, but just asking what work they enjoy, I think shares a lot. Like if they say, oh, I love planning such and such, or things like that, it's really helpful to kind of see what their strengths might be.
And Mark added in the chat that this partially is done before selecting the team members, again, making sure you're assembling the proper group, and then after through discussion, which I think is great. And Brian, through observation of team members' performance. I think that's an excellent way to look as well. You can keep those chats coming, guys. So as you keep those chats going, we'll go ahead and move into phase 2.
So our phase 2 is the planning phase, and this is the phase when you'll be making a work plan within your group. So your work plan will demonstrate your mission, your deliverables, and your outcomes. This will also be the phase where you're developing a system. So a system of when you'll meet, how often, and how you'll communicate with one another in between those meetings. This will also be the phase where you will determine if work groups are a good option for your group or not. So I have a couple of different examples of work plans that we'll go through. And this one on the right is a simple basic work plan from WorkNet. And this one lists the activity, the timeline, the staff, and the deliverable. What I like about this one is, number one, the clarity of it. I also like that there's a timeline and staff attached to it. It's really helpful for us to understand who is working on what. And sometimes it's easy to get tunnel vision on the project that we may individually be working on for the team, but it's sometimes really helpful to get a broader view and understand what each team member is working on themselves. On the next slide, I have a bit more of a detailed work plan. So when you're determining these, as I mentioned, you'll want your charges and priorities. You'll want the steps to achieve each charge and priority, and then think about that realistic time allotment. So actually on this, I have a few pop-ups. So Kirsten, if you just hit the space bar, we'll get some pop-ups. This is a work plan that we use for the Continuous Improvement Committee. This will look familiar to some of you on this call. So we have one of our missions at the top to create an evaluation framework, for example. And then we also have drivers and anchors under that description column. So what is our work rooted in, and why are we doing this work? We have expected outcomes in the activities category. I use these little pop-ups because sometimes, work plans can have different labels. So you might see description, which could mean driver and anchor, activity, which could be synonymous with expected outcome. And then with your team, depending on, usually the missions, drivers, anchors, and expected outcomes, they may or may not be assigned to you already. But then with your team, you're able to determine the deliverables at each benchmark and what that target delivery date is. Now, like Amy said, we set these work plans early on. That doesn't mean they won't change. That doesn't mean items won't be added to them. And it doesn't mean that those target delivery dates might change. We've been on work groups, we've been on teams where we have to either move forward or move back those dates. But it's good to have this work plan and have it as accurate and updated as possible, and making sure that team members are aware of where you're at in the work. Something that we really like to do is on each agenda, we're listing the drivers, the anchors, the mission, and the outcomes, just so that's always front of mind at the start of each meeting.
Yeah,
And
we've
the
spent,
next,
oh, sorry, just a real quick interjection there. We've spent a lot of time talking about how important the agenda is and how we want to be sure that if you are inviting individuals to a meeting or going to a meeting, that the agenda is out so people can look and say, again, right now, what has happened because of the pandemic, and I know what's happened to many of you, is that people are booked or overbooked, or they're booked to back to back to back to back meetings. And what we want to do through establishing that work plan and that agenda is allowing people to see the whole breadth and scope, but also to remind people, you know, what are the priorities for these particular meetings, so they can prioritize, or you can prioritize where is your time best spent. So all of this series does intertwine and go together in that idea of how are we really supporting OET in being a more effective entity. Sorry to interrupt, Molly. Go ahead. You're doing
oh no,
great.
that was great. And you made a great point. I loved Chelsea's comment earlier in this presentation about creating that large chart in the office space. I was talking to my friend recently who's a teacher in Chicago schools, and she was saying it's really hard for her students to retain information over Zoom sometimes, because in the classroom, they have all of these charts displayed. They have reminders constantly of what they're learning. But on Zoom, they're not seeing the posters on the wall and things like that. I think that applies to our work too. When we have our work plan front and center, our missions on our agenda, it's easy to constantly remember what we're doing and why we're doing it. But if it's out of sight, it's harder to retain. So I really liked that example, that when it's in your sight, it's easier to keep your mind focused. On the next slide, I mentioned drivers and anchors on the work plan slide, and I wanted to make sure to kind of show an example and explain what that is. This was an example that from our equity task force, and I really liked it for each of our work groups, because it takes the mission and really breaks it down. So what are our drivers? Who are we doing this work for? And what are our work really rooted in? Our anchors, who are our partners? Who are the people that whatever the recommendations we come up with are going to we'll need input from them and partnership from them. And then again, those expected outcomes. And the expected outcomes are so helpful, because when we get, you know, drivers and anchors and mission, it's good to have our work rooted, but it's so important to remember what those outcomes are, because we can get wrapped up in discussions or other tasks, and sometimes it's easy to forget what that expected outcome is. So I would really encourage reviewing this as much as possible, if not at every meeting, just again, to keep the focus. So on the next slide, another really important part of this phase 2 planning phase is to think about how you might communicate as a team. Now, I don't know about you, but it's easy to get things lost in email sometimes. You know, if we're sending document after document and it's a long chain, it works, but also it's easy for someone to get lost in the shuffle. So it's really important to talk with your team about what system you're going to use to work on your work in between your meetings. I have some examples here. You can use Microsoft Teams, which is an awesome tool. And I know that many of you have received training on it, or you're familiar with it from your work. Great tool. I love the file sharing on there, and it keeps everything very organized. It's also, kind of as a side note, it's really helpful for when you have documents that are a little larger. If you have a PowerPoint that is too big to send over email, it's really nice to do that on Teams. I've run into that issue quite a few times. And another idea?
I was just going to say, and Do It supports it, and you're able to send large documents over Teams that you are not able to send over your state email or even our ISU email. So think about using it for that kind of coordination and collaboration as well. Didn't mean to interrupt, sorry.
Amy and I actually just did that this morning.
Yes.
We were having a hard time sending a large file over email, and so we used Teams, and it was great. The next is calendar invites. Many people are calendar people, and we're looking at our calendars all day. So in one of the work groups that Amy and I staff, we actually send out calendar invites often when there's a deadline for something. So for example, we're collecting staff feedback on a document. So we sent out a calendar invite with the due date to the team members to give their feedback on a document, so that on the day it's due, they see on their calendar, oops, my feedback is due today. And it's easier to remember when it's right on that calendar. Google Drive is also an option. There's, within Teams, you can use the team editing function. If Teams isn't working, you can always use Google Drive, and that's another idea for sharing documents. GroupMe is something that I love, and you'll have a link to that in your resources. GroupMe is something that you can just get for your phone. We use it in some of our larger groups for while we're giving presentations, and it allows you to text within an app, but that text goes to the individuals in your group, their phone, so that during meetings, for example, you can say next slide, or oh, we need to put this on the agenda, because sometimes, as most of you may know, when you're sharing your screen on Zoom or you're presenting, you might forget to look in the chat, or you might miss a chat. And so you can get that alert right on your phone. This is a fun one. It's the stand-up meeting. So the stand-up meeting is a checkpoint with your team. And the idea is that you can do this meeting standing up. It's so concise and brief that you can do it standing up. They take about 15 minutes, and they have a similar agenda. So maybe every Wednesday, your work group has a 15-minute stand-up meeting to say, what's going well, what's a challenge, what do we have moving forward? And everyone knows the agenda. It's the same agenda each week, and it's a quick check-in. Finally, a run of show can be really helpful for your team. And if you go to the next slide, Kirsten, I'll explain what that is. So a run of show is helpful if your group is giving a large presentation or creating a report or something with many moving parts. We do this with one of the task forces that I staff before. We have large task force meetings, which have about 45 people. So we look at what time we need to complete each presentation or show a different screen during our meeting. We list who the presenter is, which team member is responsible for that, the activity. So as you'll see, the activity is often technology these days, confirm Zoom is working, controls PowerPoint. If someone's speaking, who will be the one who gets passed to next? The tech action and any notes. And this is really helpful just to look at during our meetings to make sure we're all on the same page. I also see that Mark has a great recommendation, is that when you have a document, add them to the calendar invite in addition to sending through other formats, so that it is readily available to those attending the meeting and they don't have to seek the document in multiple areas. That is a great suggestion, Mark, and I'm actually going to ask Amy to chime in because she's really good about doing that for each of the different work groups that we're a part of. So Amy, do you want to speak to that a little? To
Mark's point, and I think we do this all the time with the iWeb stuff that we do, but and Mark, I thank you for bringing this up, because think about your teammates. And again, kindness is sharing, and sharing is just being able to have that over communication. But at the same time, think about who is coming into your meetings and whether or not, or for yourself, if you're in a day, and I know we've all had them, where you have an 8 a.m., a 9 a.m., a 10 a.m., 11 a.m., I mean, you don't even have time for lunch. When you go to the calendar and everything's right there, you can walk into the meeting feeling a little bit more prepared than if you go into a meeting, you get the login, and then you have to go back and search through your email to find what the contents is, what the agenda is, what are those additional handouts. So allowing you to create an inviting space to engage with your meetings and engage with your work plans and engage with moving the things, whatever your initiative is, forward, really does lend itself to a more prepared meeting and a better taking of that agenda. So thank you so much, Mark, for bringing that up, because it does really lend itself to how are you setting that table for discussion. And if you allow people to come in and feel that they're prepared and they're ready, and not walking in saying, okay, what are we here for? it really does allow you to set that tone of, all right, we all know where we're going, and let's start. Everything's on the calendar invite. Everything's been sent in an email or on the calendar invite. I do know we work with a very diverse population, and at times what I put on the calendar invite, when I send it to OET, it ends up on your calendar invite. But I will tell you, my friends down at SIU, sometimes, and not SIU Carbondale, SIUE, because doing great with WorkNet, but sometimes if I put something on their calendar, it disappears and goes somewhere. And so you need to do that double, like make sure you're sending it out in the email and then also in calendar invite as well. So very good example. And it really just allows people to come in feeling that they are ready to contribute, which is what we want from our meetings. Go ahead, Molly.
That was great, Amy and Mark. Thank you so much. On the next slide, we have the opportunity for another chat. Thank you for sharing your suggestion, Mark. I'd love to hear any other suggestions for tools that are helpful for project management, as well as if there are tools that I mentioned that you use and you especially love.
So one of the tools, while you guys are typing, one of the tools that I like that we just started using, and we were introduced to it last fall, is Mondays. It does have a free component. It does have one that you can buy component. I don't know if it's do it eligible, but there are lots of program management systems out there, or program management software applications out there that allow you to co-collaborate. Teams is one that we use all the time because you're able to invite people from different parts of your life. And it really depends on how it's set up. We have a Teams that is set up that is just for like IWIB members, which is from all over. I have some like ISU teams. I can only invite people who have the L.E.A.D from ISU, but I do think there's a lot of fun management tools. So I'd love to hear what are some that you're using. Gantt charts. I know we have a couple people on our team and that we've worked with that just love the Gantt chart, and you can do those in Excel and really like the way in which that spells out that whole linear, that big page or picture that Chelsea was talking about earlier. That's a way to do that. It would be on a Gantt chart. Any other documents or tools that you guys like to use for project management? Or here's another question. How many of you have whiteboards in your home office? Did you have a white?
I will say, Amy, I have Post-it notes everywhere. So they kind of form their own whiteboard because they're all like posted in a square.
Well, what's funny is, so in my office at work, I'm a Post-it note gal too. So, and I have Post-it notes here, but I don't have a whiteboard, and we have one in our big in our conference room. So we have like that team, that idea that Chelsea talked about, that whole, you can walk by and see how everybody's progressing on different things that we use. But my son, who is 12, when they had to go remote back last March, literally, I would say a week in, he's like, Mom, I need a whiteboard. And so in his little bedroom, next to his little workstation, is his whiteboard. And he wrote that on every Monday. He'd fill it all out, what he needed to do, when things happen. And he uses that very well. So, and I'm a list gal. I have my list. What do I have to get done? What's top priority, low priority? Those things that we've talked about in our series last summer. I'm very much of a list person. And then I do have sticky notes for important things. Kirsten said, yes, lots of sticky notes. Post-its, yes. And a chalkboard. Nice, Chelsea. I like the chalkboard. List on Teams. Laura, I really like list on Teams. And one of the fun things about the to-do list on Teams, and it depends on how you're delegating assignments. So if you're the project manager and you're saying, I want to have everybody do something, you have to assign it to each individual person. But if you just want to get something done, like, hey, who's going to, and I'm going to use a home example right now because it's Friday, but who's going to take out the garbage? That's something that you just put up there, and then whoever does it marks it off and it's done. So looking at the ways that you can do list in Teams are really fun, and you can assign tasks in Teams on that to-do list function. The only catch is if it's something like everybody's submitting their timesheet, you have to send it to each person. That's the only catch with Teams on that one. But great suggestions. Keep those coming.
Yeah, this is helpful, really helpful to us as well, because I'm getting some new ideas. I like I didn't even think about putting a whiteboard in my house. I don't know why. I just didn't think through of it.
My 12-year-old's a little weird.
All right, anyway. Kirsten, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. And then if you think of other suggestions, by all means, please place them in the chat. I know they'd be helpful to all of us. So the final portion of the planning phase is to create your work groups. And I mentioned I would come back to this work group plan earlier. So on the left, you'll see an image of how to process work group information. So one of the work groups that I'm a part of, we have this process. So we organize information. I should say our final outcome is going to be contributing to portions of a report. So we organize information, we explore why we're reviewing it and how it'll influence our work. We discover any changes that need to be made. We select how what we're reviewing fits in with our charges and priorities. We act, and then we evaluate it and see how it worked. So it's really helpful to have something like that in your work groups, a process for filtering information. Within your work groups, you'll want to have charges and priorities and a work plan, just like the overall group. Work groups are a great opportunity for members to have an increased leadership role because it allows for another co-lead or 2 other co-leads to lead these work groups. It allows members to really get into the nitty-gritty of work and feel ownership over the work of the whole group. And if you have a large group, it's not always possible for everyone to be able to speak at a meeting or to be able to fully give their input. So this is a space for people to fully engage in what you're doing. It's also an opportunity for members to use those strengths we discussed or any other specific skill sets to accomplish work. So once you've done each of those things, you're ready to move into phase 3, which is on the next slide.
Well,
And
one of the things as we're moving forward, I want to kind of highlight and focus is if you do work groups and if you delegate, empower those you have delegated. Try to fight the urge to micromanage and attend all the work group meetings. Allow those individuals to be empowered to do the work that you've delegated for them to do. Check with their work groups. Of course, you're the manager. You need to make sure things are moving forward. But I do challenge you to empower those individuals who are delegated, because then you're going to get so much more out of your team. Allowing them to have ownership, allowing them to have opportunities to shine, and allowing them to really have voice in your success will absolutely increase your productivity. So delegate, but delegate with empowerment. Don't delegate and micromanage.
That is great, Amy. That was a really good tip. So once you've done all of that planning, you'll be ready to execute your work and really get into it. So like we mentioned earlier, it's really, really helpful when you're in the middle of achieving a big goal to include those goals on all agendas. Another thing we like to include on agendas are next steps. And so typically what I do with those are that I'll, at the end of a meeting, if I'm taking notes or working with a group, we'll go over the next steps at the end of the meeting. When I'm sending out the meeting notes or minutes to members after the meeting, I'll also take that next step section right out of the Word document I'm working on and paste it into the email so that everyone gets a second reminder of what our next steps are moving forward. As a leader, especially of a work group or a work team, it's great to check in with your members, see how they're doing, see how that work is going, see where you can help or what resources they need further. And then finally, this is a great phase to pilot test. So if you're in a work group that's creating something, get other people's opinion, ask someone to test out your process that you've created or your program or your policy and get some feedback, because you can keep iterating. I really like this quote. Again, you can tell what book I'm reading right now on the right, from Brene Brown. Daring leaders must care for and be connected to the people that they lead. And I think that really just reiterates what I mentioned with checking in with your work groups and your members, making sure that they're getting what they need to be successful. And that really speaks to what Amy mentioned about empowering them as well and feeling empowered as a member of a team. So let's move on to phase 4. We're in our final phase, which is the closure phase. This is a great phase to evaluate your progress, learn if whatever your outcome was, if you were able to achieve that. Now, some work groups may never end. You might be on a task that repeats itself each year, and the work of the group never completely ends. It just restarts. Or maybe you're on a task force or a work group that the final project was to create a presentation, a program, a report, and you've done that, you've achieved your goal. So now you need to ask, should this work carry on? Or do we revisit once a year and evaluate? What needs to happen next, and who will continue to carry that on? It's great to ask your members for evaluations, or if you are a member and ask for evaluations, to fill those out, give those evaluations so that whoever leads the same group or a similar group next has the tools they need to be successful. And one that I just love is that if you are a member or a leader, expressing appreciation is great. I think it motivates us to do better work. I work with a staff member on a task force, and she is just amazing at expressing appreciation. She asks for high quality work and she expects high quality work, but she never does not appreciate that work and makes each person feel very valued and special. So I want to leave the last 7 or so minutes to show you a few resources and leave some time for questions. So as we conclude, I would just encourage you to remember to be realistic in those time expectations. Even when you don't have control of the final deadline for something, thinking about how long things will take you to complete. Check in with your members. That's both if you're the leader of a team or just a member of a team. And determine early what the best way to communicate will be.
And be flexible. Just understand that life happens. And I don't mean that in a personal way. I mean that in a professional way. Like, no one could have seen the COVID pandemic coming, or if you could, you should have told us. But or the impact that it would have had on everyone's life. So just be flexible, give yourself grace, understand that things do happen. And if you plan, and then something goes sideways, it's so much easier to address that sideways component than if you don't have a plan to begin with. It really will so help your stress level. And this is an amazing free resource that Molly introduced us to. And Molly, I'm going to let you tell about it because Padlet is phenomenal. If you guys haven't seen Padlet yet, you should check it out. It's so much fun. Go ahead, Molly.
It's awesome. And I feel like we all kind of learned about it in the past 2 weeks. And now every time it's come up, like, how are we going to organize this? We're all like, oh, Padlet, it's fine. So this will be posted. The link that Kirsten posted in the chat at the start of this session, if you click on that, you'll find a link to this Padlet. This has all of the resources from today. We have some project charter examples, the GroupMe app, which I mentioned. This is the planning fallacy article, which I mentioned, the strengths finder. So please look through this. If you click on something, it'll take you right to the link. And just as a side note, if you ever wanted to use Padlet, which we're explaining, which can be really great for team management, it allows you to post-it notes with links, and then people can comment on these. You can use it for voting. So if you ever want more information on that, just let us know. But that's available to you. And I just want to leave the last few minutes for any questions or ideas that any of you have. We'd love to hear. I will say that I'm really thankful that you all joined us today. And I'm really thankful for all of the ideas and suggestions you have. I definitely am going to invest in getting a whiteboard. That sounds great. And I don't know why I didn't think of that before. And I really liked Mark's recommendation. Sometimes I only remember to put things in the calendar invite, like agendas or meeting notes, and I forget to also email it concurrently. So I'm definitely going to take that suggestion as well.
So I'm not seeing a lot in the chat, and I do know that it is a Friday, and I do want to thank all of you for sticking with us this morning. I don't think anyone's going to be sad if we give you 5 more minutes back to your day. Molly and I will hold on here if there are questions or comments, but that does conclude our presentation. So thank you all so much. Have a the sun is finally shining where I'm at, so have a wonderful day. Enjoy the sun. Hope your basketball team wins and everybody has a wonderful weekend. And even if you don't enjoy basketball, just have a great weekend and be outside. So thank you all for your time this morning, and have a great day.
I just wanted to jump in and thank everyone as well. My name is Kirsten Bayer. I'm on Molly and Amy's team as well. And I wanted to also put a plug in and a reminder that on Monday you will receive a follow-up email with all the resources, the website link with the resources and everything from today. Also, where you can find all of our previous OET trainings. And then also a follow-up survey. So if you'd like to give us feedback on this session, or if you have anything that you want to see in upcoming OET training sessions, we would love that feedback. I'm going to put that survey link in the chat right now for you. If you have a couple minutes in your workday this Friday and you want to take that survey now while the presentation is fresh in your mind, we welcome you to do so. But that same link will be in your follow-up email on Monday as well. So just a quick plug for that. And yeah, thank you everyone and have a great weekend. Okay, I don't see any questions coming through, so I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting for us. Bye, everyone. Thank you.